we've for some of you, depending upon where you are in the country, some of you are getting ready for your summer to end. For some of you in other parts of the country, it's kind of just beginning. So either way, I want to thank you all for being a part of this. I had one of these last year, and it was a lot of fun. We would talk more about like more like philosophical stuff last time. This time, I'd like to drill down a little bit more into some details about some things. Hopefully, this is some information that's going to be applicable to students, band directors, percussion instructors, parents, even. So hopefully there's a little bit in here for everyone. And really, what I want to do is just talk about two things, right? Because we can go down a rabbit hole on any given topic, and there's a whole lot more here than we could certainly spending an hour talking about. So I just want to talk about planning and organization, right? Of course, we're going to be talking about rehearsal and how this applies to percussion. But I think first and foremost, getting into the stuff we can do before the season starts. And as I said before, this can be applicable if you're a teacher or if you're a student. I think if you're in any kind of leadership role, you have an opportunity to plan or at least collaborate with others in some of the planning that goes on. Due to the time constraints we have, I'm just going to be using mostly drumline examples. However, with a little bit of creativity, you can certainly see how a lot of these concepts can apply to pit percussion, indoor percussion, percussion ensemble, concert band, even up all the way down to private lessons and solo playing, things of that nature. Um, the scheduling that I'd like to do here is start with some concepts, and maybe in the second half of this, I have some materials I can share with you that shows how we apply these concepts at Mississippi State. And of course, that's always a little bit dangerous because even though we all might want similar things, we all want to have a good program, we all want the students to have a good time, to grow. We want the same thing, same positive things for the staff as well too. The individual pieces of our puzzles are often different, right? We come from programs of different sizes, different resources, different ability levels, different levels of support, different sizes of staff. So I caution you to take anything I say, the specifics of it, take it with a grain of salt and see if it's something you could apply to your program, maybe by adapting it to the specificities of what your situation is, or if it's something that totally doesn't relate to what you do at all, you can just use it as a way to reaffirm what you're already doing. So I think with sessions like this, it's always, I think they always work well if they're presented just as ideas and kind of getting our brains all working and thinking through some things before our fall season and our band camp season begins. Okay, so I think there's a lot of things you can do before you even get into camp that can help really set yourself up for success. And I believe I've emailed everybody on the list a copy of the handout. So I'm going to be going through that and sort of filling that in a bit with some details. So if you could pull that up, if you have it, if for some reason you don't have it, that's fine. Send me an email, and when we're done here, I can send it out to you. All right. So a lot of things you can do to ensure as successful of a experience as possible take place well before band camp even happens. In our program here, I'm going into my 20th year here, And if we have a problem during the season, like a problem like some issue comes up in October or something like that, I think of it as not being an October problem. It's actually like a June problem or a May problem. It's something that I didn't really think to anticipate. It's something that probably I could have gotten out in front of and prevented a little bit better earlier on. And of course, that's what kind of keeps me coming back each year here is that there's always something new that comes up. And then when you get ready for the next year, you know to look for and sort of plan for it earlier on, or at the very least, when things do come out of left field during the season, if you have everything else planned as well as possible, it makes your energy as efficient as possible in dealing with the things that come up during the season. So, making sure that student expectations are communicated before the summer starts, right? So at MSU, we have our auditions during the spring, like in April or May. Even if you don't have auditions until the first day of band camp or sometime during the summer, you can still communicate what the expectations of the program are, what the expectations of camp are, what the for the season, even if the students haven't received their spots yet. If you've had your auditions already during the spring, then to come in um, with those expectations in place works extremely well. But even if just because of logistics or scheduling, you're not really able to make those placements until later, you can still send out information in late spring or over the summer. This can have to do with the schedule, when they'd be expected to be there for camp, what kind of absences are excused, which ones are not, what they're expected to have, things they're expected to bring with them. If you're able to send out music during the summer, what the expectation is there, should they be able to play through it? Should it be memorized? All those different things. So that way they know coming in and the culture of your program is set well in advance. Um, Two, making sure the equipment is in good working order. And this is a great job for student leaders to go in and make sure that all of the equipment sounds good, it's all working well, making sure that all of the cord on your keyboard percussion is in good shape, making sure all the sticks and mallets have been ordered, making sure the heads, if you're not doing a drum head change before camp, make sure all the heads that are on there sound good, right? That's something as percussionists we don't necessarily think about as much as other instruments do, right? Our sound. We spend a lot of time talking about technique and how we hold the sticks and different grips and different things like that. But something even from a very early age with winds or voice or anything like that, they're talking about their sound. They're talking about their sound quality. And something we can achieve right off the bat before we even discuss that from a playing standpoint is how do our instruments sound? And what I tell my section leaders, my upperclassmen, is the expectation is when the new players walk in that first day of camp or that first day of auditions or anything like that. All of the equipment is set out, it's lined up, it looks sharp, it sounds good. So that way, right off the bat, the only impression, the only opinion that those students are going to have of your percussion program is a drum line that is organized and it sounds good. Now, of course, the maintenance and the tuning thing is a day-to-day of affair throughout the season. I mean, we're a big drum line here. We burn through an awful lot of gear, an awful lot of hardware. It's something that we have to have like a separate plan in place during the fall in order to keep up with. But since we have that time during the summer, why not get that going? Right? Making sure the students have their music. If the music's been written beforehand. And this might be something maybe student leaders don't deal with this as much, but certainly the percussion instructor and at the very least the band director, um, if the music's been written and the assignments from the audition have been solidified, making sure that everybody has their music in plenty of time. And if you have a more mature group, you can even give assignments there as to what they're expected to know coming into camp. That can cut down an awful lot of time there. It can save an awful lot of time. And making sure you have an exercise program, and an exercise program that meets the needs of the players, meets their ability, meets them where they are, and works to warm them up each day to get their muscles going, because percussion is a physical activity. And if you want to play throughout your entire life, which for those of you in high school and college, I want you absolutely, when you're an old person like me, to still be playing. And two ways to do that is to take care of your hearing, so wear your earplugs, and to take care of your hands, so warm up every single day. And also in the exercise packet, make sure that it's addressing specific challenges that are in your music, right? If there are things in there that, because of the level of the students, it's a challenge for them to get through sections of the music, make sure you're addressing that in your exercise packet each day. So if you have, say, triplet rolls at a certain tempo in the show, and maybe that's not really happening during band camp, have an exercise there. So every day, I tell my students it's sort of like doing planks. You don't have to do them for long each day, but if you do them every single day over the course of the season, not only is it going to work well in the show music, but most importantly, they're going to be experiencing some serious growth over the season as players. All right. So the next thing is, how do you set up a daily rehearsal schedule? And there are a bunch of ways to do this based upon the level of your group and how much music you're able to get through. Right. Think, as I mentioned before, it's all about planning and organization. So if you have a group that is younger, that is less experienced, that's fine. Making sure the music is written to their level, so it's something that's achievable, but also, even more so, getting out in front of the planning process and being conservative in what your expectations are. If as early as you can start and as organized as you can be, that's going to be a great thing. All right. So if we look at this here, I came up with an example for a 3 hour block. And that's sort of assuming that there's other things going on during camp. If you have a whole week of just percussion camp, which is great, I mean, we have that here, you might have that at your school, in which case you can expand it out even more, do multiple blocks. Or if the only thing you have is band camp, obviously percussion sectionals are going to be a smaller part of that day. Typically, when I think of rehearsal blocks, just based on what we've done and kind of my experiences coming up in band and in drum corps, usually a 3 hour block is kind of the standard. So just to show how I might break that down, I would use 20 minutes of time on the warm up, on the technique. So some time to get their hands going, but also spend a little bit of time delving into some of those challenging techniques, followed by a 5 minute break. And then 50 minutes of anything that's new. So whatever your goal is for that day, and I'll give some examples of that a little bit later of how you might break down a chart. But 50 minutes of stuff that's new. I like to do that not only in my teaching, but in my individual practice as well too, where whenever my brain is most fresh, that's when I'm going to learn the stuff that's new, right? Because later on when I'm tired and I'm hungry and I'm hot, my brain's it may be more of a challenge to get my brain 100% locked in. And so if we're doing a review of other material, that might be a little bit more conducive than trying to pull out something new at the very end of a rehearsal block. Um, and then followed by a 10-minute break, then review the previous music for 50 minutes, followed by a 10-minute break. And then at the very end, taking some of what we've already done and oftentimes a smaller segment of it just based on the practicality of it and work on memorization. I do include memorization as part of our schedule, even though I ask the students to come in with certain music, especially our cadences, memorized. I like to spend time on that just to make sure that they've memorized it correctly, right? Especially with some of the younger students there, they may have done their best and they've put in the time during the summer, but you do want to check and make sure everything is learned correctly. That's another one of those things that could be an October problem, but if you address it in August, it's an August problem, and I'd rather fix my problems in August. Okay, so next up, the execution of how we come up with this. So the pacing, right? Um, how do we think about tempo and how do we think about what's a manageable chunk of music we can learn each day with the amount of time we have, right? So a good way to start is just take the amount of measures you have to learn and the amount of days in which you have to learn them and dividing it up. And if you ask my uh, students here, we do that all of the time when planning things for a percussion ensemble. And my students taking private lessons here, when they bring me a solo and there's a performance date down the road, um, that's usually the first thing I do, just to say, okay, at a minimum, how many measures a day do you have to learn in order to, okay, the performance is in 2 months, you want to have it completely playable in 6 weeks. So you have a couple of weeks to do some repetitions, get comfortable, play for other people, right? This is no different than our goals in marching band. That way, at a minimum, if you learn this amount each day, you should be all set. And usually what happens, because not all of the music is equally as difficult, you'll run into certain days where the 10 measures or the 20 measures that you're assigned to learn aren't that hard. So you can obviously start working ahead and adapting the schedule. I'll talk a little bit about more about that as we move on. Next up is tempo. If you're in camp, there's not really a reason to play your stuff at the full tempo unless you've had it all spring and you've got a bunch of monsters for players, right? So I would much rather learn it slow, because the slower you learn something, the slower you forget it. I'll say that again. The slower you learn something, the slower you forget it. In fact, I have a colleague who teaches piano here at MSU, and she has a saying that, or something she tells her students, as you get closer to the performance, you should be practicing slower, right? And really making sure that mentally and muscle memory wise, you're going in and checking and making sure everything is completely solid. And something I use with my students is take the most difficult passage in a piece of music and let that be the dictator of how fast you should be playing the whole thing. So say the chart that I'm going to be using as an example in a little while is marked at a quarter note equals 160, right? If the hardest lick in that piece or the drum line can play at 120, they should be playing the whole piece at 120. So that way their hands don't know any different. And then as that lick gets better, say you could play it at 140 the next week, you bring the whole thing up. Because where we get memory slips quite often is in cases where we've learned something differently than how we're going to perform it, right? Our hands don't have little brains of their own. They only do what we allow them to do. So if you play the bulk of the chart at a faster tempo, and then we have to drop the tempo for the hard part, and then we bring it back up after the hard part's over, and we do this in our individual practicing too. I can hear my students in the practice rooms sometimes doing this, where they'll drop the tempo on the hard part, but then when the fun part that they can play comes back, they'll play it faster. Well, when we get into performance, and any kind of performance, could be marching, could be concert, could be solo, if our hands are used to that and then we want them to play consistently, they're not going to know what to do, right? So practice slow the way you want to play fast. Okay? As far as teaching strategies go, and this could apply, of course, to directors, to instructors, but also as student leaders, you're going to have an opportunity, most likely, to take members of the group off by yourself, or if the instructor's working with another part of the drum line, and you might be asked to go off and lead parts of the rehearsal. So one thing that I like to do a lot is constant playing. I can be a bit of a talker, so I have to discipline myself to only talk when I absolutely need to. In fact, a teacher of mine, a man by the name of Mark Ford, he was talking to me one time about teaching or percussion pedagogy, and he explained it like this: only talk when you absolutely need to, right? Because chances are, if you have a 3 hour block of rehearsal time, that's more playing those students are doing there than they probably have done at home, right? So I would rather miss a detail here or there and keep them playing, keep the repetitions going. And if I have to explain something, maybe not even talking, going up, having them stop, I don't talk, I play, and then have them play. Or I'll move down the line and play on each person's drum and maybe make little motions here or there to indicate to them what I want them to do. Because as soon as you stop talking, the attention goes like that, right? The attention goes down. People start realizing they're tired, or they're hot, or they're hungry, or they're thirsty. The cell phones start to come out. Everything starts to go to rack and ruin, right? So if you can keep them playing, especially if you're an inexperienced teacher, or if you're a student leader and maybe you're not as secure, not as confident about speaking in front of the group and knowing what to say, nothing wrong with just keeping them going. All right. I'm a big fan of really going slow. And when we work on our material at camp, I will go measure by measure. And you'll see when I give my little breakdown, my schedule of what, of how we approach things each day, it's a small enough chunk, it's conservative enough, so that way um, we can go measure by measure. In fact, I remember when I was in drum corps, I had an instructor by the name of Lee Bettis, and he would go beat by beat. If our focus for that rehearsal was, say, letter A to letter C, we 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 would set up with the pit and the battery and literally go beat by beat by beat. And we would add on, take just beat one. We would do that a bunch. Take beats one and two. And it does a couple of things. One, as an instructor or as a leader, it allows you to really watch each person and catch any mistakes, any details, any misunderstandings right off the bat. Two, as a player, if you can do that, if you can go into the practice room and discipline yourself to do that, you're going to learn it on a deep, deep level. Okay, so don't be afraid to slow it down, take one measure at a time, take very small segments. Some common things I wrote down when playing through different sections: don't necessarily play everything always as written, play it in a way that addresses whatever the technical issue is, right? If there is a problem in the rhythm, take out the drags, take out the flams, take out the rolls, take out any kind of embellishment, because probably the tempo is still going to be bad, right? If we listen to a passage that has drags or flams and the tempo's not consistent 80% of the time, if I take those elements out and just play the rhythm, the 16th notes or eighth notes or whatever it is, chances are the rhythm is still not going to be exact. So get the rhythm right first and then add the extra toppings on top of it. And don't be afraid to stay with that, right? So even in the first week of camp, if there's a passage that has flams and they're having trouble playing the underlying rhythm, don't be afraid, don't feel like you need to be in a hurry to add those things back in. Because if you just put it back in when it's not time to, you're not only did you not solve something, but you're also making it worse because you're taking the time you could have taken to fix it and not fix it. So even if you get to that first show or the first performance and they're still not able to put those flams in, the drum line can only play at the level that they're playing at. So I would say, keep it as basic as it needs to be until those fundamental things are in place. Um, if you're having a trouble, if you're having trouble with sticking, say a paradiddle passage or something like that, try taking out the accents and only fighting a battle, or not trying to fight a battle on multiple fronts. If it's a sticking problem, don't compound it with accents, don't compound it with dynamics. Only work on the thing that's a problem. And again, going at a slow pace, you should be able to identify, or it'll help you identify what the issue is. So you can give really specific feedback instead of just, that was dirty, play it clean, that wasn't good. In drumming, it's usually one of two things. Either it's too slow or it's too fast, or you played it too low or too high. There's other things in there, more advanced things you can get into, but in percussion, I said drumming, but in percussion in general, it's one of those two things, right? It's either a timing issue, which most of the time it is, in which case the timing is like, if you're going to work on tuning, don't tell somebody they're not in tune, have the ears or have the resources to tell them you're flat or you're sharp. If you're talking about time, don't say that was out of time. Say that was early, that was late, that was slow, that was fast. Or if it's a balance problem, which you can tell without even listening sometimes, the sticks or mallets were too high or they were too low. And oftentimes the timing is affected by the stick height, right? Um, for the tenors, I'm old fashioned. And this is something that I terrorize our tenor line with here. If you can't play it on one drum, you can't play it on 5 or 6 drums, right? So you can have them take out the scrapes or the around part and play it only on one drum. On the bass drum, some things that have helped us, I'll play the rhythm on the snare drum. I'll go up to somebody in the snare line and whatever the composite rhythm that the bass line is playing, I'll play that on my drum. Um, Playing split parts as unison rhythms. This one has really paid off well for us. So say for example, the bass line has boom, ba bum, ba bum, 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 bum. Just 1, a 2, a 3, and 4, and. Have them as a unison bass drum section play. Boom, ba boom, ba boom, 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 boom. All at the same time. So they understand, they get it in their ears how the overall rhythm goes. And then plugging their individual part in, for us, that's worked like magic. And again, I can't take credit for inventing that approach, but I read it or I saw somebody do it, and we were working on something a couple of drum camps ago, and we were just like, couldn't get it. And it was hot outside. I'm like, guys, come on, you know. But so we tried that, and it was one of those deals where I was like, whoa, that fixed it. So not only was that a good technique for me to use, but then when the bass drum captain was in subsectionals, she could do that. And it's something where she didn't have to do a lot of explaining or talking. If there was a problem, she'd go, okay, take that measure and we'll just play it unison. And without any talking, without any over philosophizing or anything like that, she 9 times out of 10 it would fix it. And then of course, if you have any kind of split parts, 30 seconds, sextuplets, 16th notes, have them play the eighth note outline first and have them stay with that, just like I mentioned with the embellishment thing in the snare drums or tenors, have them stay with the outline until they're comfortable. All right. So if adding in the 30-second notes causes problems, have them stay with those eighth notes for as long as it takes, right? And again, if the music is arranged well, the eighth note will serve the same purpose as that filled in 30-second note. If you have a cymbal line, which we do. We have like 15 or 16 or 17 of those things this year. It's going to be wild. I tell all my students if they want to be on ESPN to play cymbals for us because it's big and it's visual and all that. But along with that, we do have some involved cymbal parts, so we do have to spend a lot of time cleaning those the same way we would clean a snare drum, tenor, or bass drum part. So having them clap their part so they can hear the rhythm a little bit more succinctly. Also, in the same vein, having them play a rhythm with the hi-hat sound only, right? Instead of getting into the crashes and the split stuff and all the different sounds. As I mentioned before, don't try to fight a battle on multiple fronts. If you're working on rhythm only, try to simplify everything else and just have them do that with the hi-hat sound. Cool? So next, talking about assessment. You want to give the students a goal, and you also want to see if your plan has been working, because your plan should be flexible, right? If you spend some time before camp coming up with a plan, and then you come in on the first day of camp and you realize you either undershot or overshot, or there's something in there that you could do better, the best thing to do is to adapt it, right? So the way we figure out if it's working or not is through how we assess. So something that we do during camp here is we have pass offs. So we have a goal for each week. For the end of the first week, we have all of our cadences memorized. It used to be at the end of drum camp that was the case, but then a couple of years back, I think that they wanted to up their game a little bit, so they passed them all off at the end of drum camp. And I went, well, if you can do that, you just made it harder for all the other drum lines that are going to come after you, because I'm going to have them do that as well too. So I think if you know if you're teaching a smaller program, or I mean, you can completely make that based upon the level and the experience of the group. You know, you want it to be something that's attainable for them. And as long as you're sticking with your program and as long as you've planned it out for the long game, I think it's just a matter of time and staying consistent until everything gets passed off. Something else that we began doing is video assignments. And this isn't something we do for the whole group, but it's something that we started doing during the pandemic. I think a lot of people did. Um, and say, for example, if I have a student, we get into the season and there's maybe a part or two that's not exactly right. They're kind of struggling a little bit. they're obviously working hard, but just maybe they're new or something, and learning these things is something they've never had to do, so they're struggling a bit. Giving them a video assignment, one, it saves rehearsal time where I don't necessarily have to take that student off by themselves. And also, the thing I love about doing video assignments is that they self-assess. Because I think we've all been in this situation before, right? If we're all percussionists, like we've had to make some kind of video or we've made a video or something like that. And before we send it off, I would assume most, if not all of us, watch it back. And we watch it and we go, oh man, that wasn't as good as I could have done it. I could have done that better. All right. And you go back and you do it again. And in that moment, as a teacher, I love that because my job as a teacher is to teach you to teach yourself. All right. So if you're having students send in videos, they're self-assessing to the best of their ability. You know, I mean, as teachers, our job, or as leaders, our job is to help them to recognize what the issues might be and how to fix them. But to the best of their ability, they're probably doing multiple takes, right? And if you don't have time to do pass offs, I know once you get through camp, we're all off and running with school and all the other things we have going on. Doing videos as a form of doing pass offs, I think that works very well. I'll do that sometimes. Like for percussion ensemble here, I'll make that part of their grade, or for our uh, steel drum band, where we don't have time necessarily to listen to every single person play, but we do have a concert coming up. So how can I assess that? So I have them make videos, and 9 times out of 10, even with the players who in rehearsal the week before weren't doing well, their video is much improved because it's an assessment. They know it's like a grade or something like that. So there's some motivation, but also they listen back. They're going to spend time in the practice room, they're going to be self motivated. Okay, so next up, I mentioned this a little bit before, but adaptation. How do we continue to grow, continue to improve our process? Because all of our planning, even though we might feel really, really confident about it, it's all done in the theoretical, right? Until we get to camp and there's actual students playing the music and going through the week, we don't know if it's actually going to work because there's a million different variables that could be introduced there. So the first thing to do, we always overlook this, or at least I find myself overlooking it, is asking for feedback. All right. If you're a student leader, ask the band director or the percussion instructor for feedback. And even though you might not be planning the entire week yourself, there are going to be things that you're having to organize. Asking feedback from the staff and the students. This is a big one. I remember when I was younger and not as experienced and not as confident, not as secure, I would have never asked the students for feedback because I thought, well, I'm the teacher, they're the student, their job is to do what I say. And if I ask them, they're going to think that I don't know what I'm doing or something like that. The best way, even with groups that are younger, they will know what's working for them and what's not. Are we going too fast on something? Are we spending too much time on something? They're not as confident on this, so we should spend more time on that as opposed to that. I had a situation last year where I was doing a lot of ensemble rehearsal with the drum line during our afternoon rehearsals, and the section leader or a couple of the student leaders came to me and said, you know, there's a bunch of us, there's things that we need to address individually in our sections, but us just playing as a group, we're not really able to manage the time efficiently and do that. Would it be possible for us to break it up like this? So maybe the tenor drums go off by themselves. There was a kid who was, who still wasn't confident on some parts. He wanted to go off by himself and use that time to practice. And I think pretty much each member or each subsection within the group had some kind of specific thing they felt we could have used the time better on. And just me being older and maybe a bit more confident, I was like, yeah, sure, that's great. And guess what? We accomplished two things. We were able to obviously get the things done that we needed to. And also it allowed the students to feel like they had bought in, right? They had some kind of say that I was going to listen to them. And it builds an additional layer of positivity within your culture. Um, and then you can also look to, and this is more for the band director or the percussion director, but I think it can certainly apply to the students as well. Is the percussion section aligned with the goals of the band, right? Um, if the goal of the band is to be able to play the opener by the end of the first week, the goal of the drum line should be also to play the opener by the end of the first week, not kind of walk through the opener, kind of sort of play it, but then spend our time working on a bunch of cadences. All right, make sure that first and foremost, the drum line is helping the band sound good. All right. And then this next thing is more for the directors and the instructors, but assessing, does the music have to be changed or adapted in some way? And you can usually tell by the end of maybe the second week or so, right? Is there some stuff that's not working with the full band? It's not necessarily doing musically what we need it to do. Or another big one, due to the staging on the field, when we start putting it on the field, are there timing things or balance things? The balance things you can adjust more just with having the players play differently. But are there timing things? Are there entrances which are going to be battles we're fighting all season that our time would be better spent if we adapted the parts earlier on in the season, right? Are there certain sections that when it was written, we were thinking the level of the drum line or pit might be one thing, right? It might be overwritten. And instead of spending the fall developing as players, the students are unfortunately just trying to have to fight against writing that is too advanced, in which case I think two bad things happen. One, they're not spending the time on the things that might be a little bit more basic that can help them grow. It's also going to be discouraging because it's never going to sound as good as it could possibly sound, right? And also adapting your exercises throughout the season. This is something we do a bit at MSU as well. One, just to keep it engaging, because you play the same exercises over and over, it can get kind of mindless. Um, but also if there's a specific challenge, if something we didn't anticipate in the summer comes up as being a challenge later on during the season, having a schedule that is fluid and flexible is always going to be very important, right? Who was it? I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson said, a pointless consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, which means like if you just stick with a plan because you have the plan, because you want to be consistent with that plan, but it's not really it's working against what your goals are, but you're more concerned with not changing anything, then it's actually doing the opposite of what you're setting out for. Okay, so next up, with the last bit of time we have here, what I want to do is show some examples. Again, we don't have a lot of time, but I'll show some examples of how I would apply this, apply some of these ideas here. So let me see here. All right, so I'm sharing my screen. First thing we talked about was communicating over the summer. And if anybody wants copies of these, feel free to send me an email, and I'll send them out to you. Feel free to copy them or adapt them. Um, these are just concepts that have worked for me. I'm actually about to send some of this out to our current drum line, but this is the idea from what we've had in the past, right? So making sure they're keeping up with the correspondence from the band office. They know when drum camp begins. They know when to check into their dorms. Um, Knowing what's not excusable for some people, they have something that has to do with school, like they're in some kind of like summer school type thing where they have to miss some of our activities. That's cool. But if you have stuff like work or anything like that, we ask you, as much as we love to see you working, to have that end by the time you show up to camp. Um, Again, I don't need to walk you through every little detail here. We talk about what to bring to camp, right? So their music, which we send to them over the summer, weather appropriate clothing. There's always that one cat who likes to wear jeans at camp and wear shorts when it's snowing outside. We ask you to not be that person. Your clothing, your sneakers, your sunblock, your water bottle, your alarm clock, which again, most of us have on our phones, your aspirin, because unless you've been playing all day, all summer, your hands are going to swell most likely. Band-aids for the snare drums right here, right? For the bass drums right here, for the mallet players right here. And then we have some other information here. Again, if you're teaching high school, you can put in things here about the fall schedule, fall rehearsals, just so that way everybody knows what's going on. It's one less thing that you have to contend with. And also, I think it allows the students and the parents to be to have a good feeling about what's going on because they know that their time is going to be used efficiently. So let me see here. Full screen mode here. So, talking a bit about preparation, right? So, how we prepare for band camp. We send out that information. We have our auditions early on. We send out our music. Um, I have my section leaders inspect our gear by May 1st. And that's right around the time that we have our audition. So right when we know how many of which instrument we're going to be using, they have an assignment to go in there and let me know what our collection of sticks and mallets is like, how many of those we need to order, what our heads are, how many of which head we have, and I have them communicate all of this to me by the end of finals, which is again for us is like that first week of May. So that way when they go home, I have all of that information. I can get in touch with our office, they can get in touch with our companies, and it gets ordered so that way we're not having to scramble when it comes time for camp. Cliff Taylor and I, um, we write the music in June, and then usually the parts get sent out either late June or early July. And then having an exercise program. And I'm going to give an example here for our for the purposes of demonstration, right? I'm going to use a chart that we're going to be playing this fall called Malaga, which for those of you that are a little bit older like me, maybe you came up in like the 80s or 90s. This was kind of a classic drum corps Latin tune, and we're going to be playing it this fall. And I picked a tune that was a little bit longer. Um, it's about 120 something measures long. So that way I could show you if I was teaching this to a group, how I would break it down, right? So we don't need to necessarily look at the chart itself. to get this, but if we look through it, if we were to go through it, we would see, okay, to play this chart, the snare drums are playing a lot of paradiddle diddles, a lot of triplet rolls, a lot of tap drags. The tempo for the most part is 160. At the very end, it goes up to 182. So we're talking some serious density of note per square inch type playing. And the tenor is the same as the snare drums. We have some 16th note scrapes at 160 beats per minute at the end of the tenor feature that takes place. In the bass drums, we have some unison eighth notes, which normally you wouldn't think of as being challenging. They're not hard to conceptualize or play, but especially with us, we have 8 bass drums. Even with a smaller group of 5 bass drums, having your unisons be together is deceptively hard, or can certainly be deceptively more challenging. And then we have some split eighths, sextuplets, and 32nd notes occurring on the beat, on the eighth note subdivision, again at a pretty fast clip, 160, 182. And in the cymbals, we have syncopated eighth notes. So that's sort of the outline of when I write my exercises, or I have exercises or warm-ups I'm going to work with them on. I want to incorporate those things, right? And as those things become more confident, maybe there's stuff in other music we're playing that'll be challenging. So I'm going to trade those exercises out to make sure that I'm using that technique, the technique program, to build them, not only to be able to play the charts and do the band show, but also help them to be more accomplished musicians and percussionists. Okay, so now how I would break this down. And I'm going to step away from my role at MSU for a second, because most of the time, just based on the players we have, we're certainly very fortunate. We have players who audition from all over the country. We can be very selective with who we pick. We can be very demanding with the pace at which we work and the amount of individual work I expect of them outside of rehearsal. So we move at a little bit different pace per se than maybe you would in a smaller program. But say if I was given this chart and say I was teaching it to a high school or a group that maybe wasn't as advanced, say I was working with a college drumline that was not playing at the level that we're playing. Or so I had this chart and I was given 6 days to teach this, but also have them memorize it, right? The goal for the end of that week, or however these 6 days would go by, maybe 6 days of camp, maybe 6 rehearsals over the course of summer, maybe some springtime rehearsals, maybe some after school rehearsals during the fall. However, the 6 days were to add up, this would be a way I would approach it. And this is, as I mentioned before, I can sometimes err on the side of being overly conservative, overly safe. I would rather have the students be bored and know that I needed to up the pace a bit than go in and have these unrealistic goals of music that I want to learn in a shorter amount of time. Okay, so for example, I'd start with my warm up, um, 20 minutes a day. And then on that first day, since there's no old music to review, I'm essentially going to take 2 days worth of new music to learn and divide it over 2 hours. So 50 minutes playing, 10 minutes break, 50 minutes, 10 minutes break. Then for the memorization component, I'm going to take half of that. Then when I go into that next day, I'm essentially doing about 20 new bars of music per day. As I mentioned before, I like to be mathematical about it. I'll just divide up the amount of measures that we have to learn over the amount of days that we have. So for my new music, 45 through 69, then I would review the top to 45 and then go back over and work on memorizing 27 to 45. And then you can look down the whole schedule here. It all adds up by the last day. We have our warm up. We do our memorization of the final chunk, and then we're able to review all of it from memory. So that way, when we put it with the band, everybody's confidence is as high as it can be. And then if the students have been able to work ahead at all, as I mentioned before, there's going to be sections that are easier, sections that are more pattern based. They can obviously work ahead. Or, as I mentioned even earlier, if you're able to give your students assignments during the summer for them to memorize or learn portions of the music before they get to camp, this just puts you even further out in front. Now, looking at it from a weekly basis here, let me see. This is an example of how we did our camp last year, just to give you some insight into that, where we're not necessarily spending 3 hours on any one thing. We do move a bit faster, but we do account for our breaks for each 50-minute chunk. I like to give them 10 minutes, to get some water, go in the air conditioning if they need to, kind of let their brain rest. We spend the majority of our day, which we generally go from 9 until 8, working on our junction show, which is our big drumline spectacular thing we do out in front of the stadium a couple hours before the kickoff to our football game. And usually our show music we write to be learnable in a shorter amount of time. Um, Mostly because we do a few different shows, and some of those we're putting in during the fall semester. Like if we put a show in during October, that's usually right during midterms. So I want to write the music so it's something that we can memorize and bring up and put on the field pretty efficiently. So as you've noticed here, I have a goal for each day, what we get to. And as I mentioned before, these are all very conservative goals, and especially with some of the stuff, if it's music we've played before, we can usually move ahead, which certainly helps us in the overall process. And then you notice at the bottom, we talk about our pass offs. And then also the tempos for all the cadences in that first week are 90 beats per minute. And most of the cadences, kind of a general cadence tempo, is like 120, right? I do not let them play above 90 beats per minute for that first week, and it drives them crazy, right? um, but again, I want them to be able to learn it slowly so they forget it slowly. So that way, during the fall, when they have their classes and their labs and their social life and everything else that's going on, I want band and drumline to be a part of their life, but I don't want it to be their entire life. The better prepared we are, the more solid our foundation is, the more dialed in our muscle memory is on all of those things, the smoother sailing is going to be when all the other aspects of their life as students come into play as well. And I know that's certainly the case for high school. I have a son who's in the high school band here in Starkville, and those kids, yeah, they have band and they practice very seriously for their performances, but they all have, they have school, they have social life, they have their church, they have scouts, they have a lot of different things going on. So the more solidly and slowly we can learn this and intentionally we can learn these things during the summer before we're off to the races with school and everything else, I think the better chance we are, or the better chance we have to have a really positive experience. So we're a little bit over time.